Hi guys, welcome back to Noah's MMA. I'm Noah and welcome to the show. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I talk about a lot of stuff on this channel, but majority of the stuff revolves around balance in your life, meditation, spiritual practices, my experiences, things I've been through, stories that made me a better person. I'm not trying to be one of those influencers that says, hey, I've got it all together and my life is great, because it's not. I'm a work in progress and I want to document my progress in life. And one thing that has riddled me for most of my life, and I think everybody can relate to it, is anxiety. Now, anxiety can come in many forms. Off the top of my head, I know there's generalized anxiety disorder, there's panic attacks, there's OCD, depersonalization, dissociation. Those sorts of things are usually symptoms of anxiety. Dissociation is something that I've experienced for the last 10 years, maybe longer. My anxiety symptoms were drug use, using substances to cope with my anxiety. In grade school, I was not popular. I was a little on the heavy side for some of the years, and I never really had a group that I felt like I could fit into. I was always kind of misunderstood. Nobody really knew what I was about. And in turn, I turned to marijuana and alcohol pretty young. I would say around 13 or 14. And looking back on it, this was all just to, like I said, cope with anxieties that come with growing up and trying to understand who you are. I would say, honestly, I didn't really know who I was until my mid-20s. It's only been the last couple years that I've learned to really cope with anxiety and understand that most of my issues revolve around it. Anxieties that we experience usually don't come true. They are loaded thoughts in our mind that carry a lot of energy, and majority of the anxiety experience, at least for me actually, is stored in my body. So ways in which I've been able to cope is through exercise. I hate to beat that like a dead horse, but exercise is the number one thing you can do for anxiety. And if you can get a group like a martial arts gym or a spin class or something of that nature, maybe a hiking group, you're going to start to feel community and you're going to start to build confidence in areas you didn't know you had. We all need our tribe. We need to find our tribe, and it's pretty difficult. I'm spending time on the East Coast, and I was at a jiu-jitsu gym for a couple years, and I recently tried to find a new one because jiu-jitsu is my main coping mechanism for my anxiety. And it's been difficult because going into a new gym is like going into a family that you don't know. And although we all have the common ground of loving martial arts and having a love for the art, it's been anxiety producing, and I find myself not going as much as I should. So for me, anxiety has unraveled itself and showed itself, per se, in multiple forms. Like I said, when I was young, I used drugs to cope and cover up my anxieties and traumas I'd experienced as a kid. I actually used drugs until my mid-20s, and that was my main way of coping with it. In my mid-20s, I actually got sober, and I kind of substituted one drug for another. I went from drugs to food, and I gained around 80 pounds. I actually weighed like 260 pounds. Right now I'm 190. So in 2019, I went back to martial arts, and I remember I lost something like 70 pounds in the course of like 9 months. It got me back to feeling confident about myself and having self-esteem. Because I never really felt good looking most of my life, and frankly I wasn't up until my mid-20s, early 20s, my body image really means a lot to me. And although I do suffer from a form of body dysmorphia, I've really had to learn to separate myself from attaching my identity to how I look. Although I was using drugs in my early 20s, I was able to get jobs actually as a model, which is just mind-blowing because I don't really like to get my picture taken. As I was developing that, as well as acquiring skills as a chef, I also decided that I wanted to pursue acting. Looking back on it, it's really because I didn't feel comfortable being Noah. I felt comfortable being other characters. And I love acting, and I always will. It'll always be something I'll pursue. But I've realized that I've just not felt comfortable in my own skin for years and years and years. What ended up happening that really opened my eyes to what was going on with me was when I decided that I wanted to lose the weight. I decided it was time. I decided I had enough clarity, and although the martial arts was the exercise part of it, there was a part of it which was counting calories, counting all the macros that I was eating. And I developed a really severe case of OCD. And this was just my anxiety running wild, not having drugs to cover up the anxiety, not having food anymore. The way something like OCD works is that it's actually an anxiety disorder. And when you don't have a vice to cope with that anxiety, what happens with obsessive compulsive disorder is you start to get compulsive about certain things. Now, we all know the person that washes their hands a million times. What's actually happening there is each one of those times they are getting a little dopamine release, and their anxiety is quelled for a short amount of time. However, over time, those little compulsions don't give the anxiety release that it used to, so it gets worse and worse and worse. In my case, I started counting calories to a absolutely toxic and unhealthy level. I would make sure that I knew exactly how much I ate every single day, down to the calories, carbs, and fat. Now, granted, I am a diabetic, so I need to count carbs anyways, but I was doing this to an absolutely ritualistic, unhealthy level. If I had gotten to the end of the day and I didn't know how many calories I had taken in and how much calories I had expended, I would not be able to go to sleep. I would do these calculations until I had the exact number and knew how much calories I was at in a deficit. Now, it really wasn't until a year of doing this, like I said, it took me about a year to lose all that weight, that I realized what was happening. It took me going to therapy, which opened my eyes to what I was experiencing. I didn't realize that these compulsions had gotten to the level until I started having other compulsions. Once I'd lost all the weight and I didn't need to count calories anymore, the OCD persisted. It turned into something even more delusional, which was worrying about getting sick. I started to become a major hypochondriac. I had bodily symptoms that didn't exist. I started to think that there was something wrong with my heart. I started to think there was something wrong with my lungs. And I would go obsessively to doctors to try to find out what was going on. It was around this time that it was pointed out to me that this was actually a psychological issue. There was nothing wrong with me physically, but I believed there was. I remember reading a story of a man who had OCD, and it was a really bad case. He believed that at some point during the day, little knives were coming out of his fingers, so the people that he touched were going to get cut. Now, this is an extreme example of a delusion, almost a hallucinatory delusion. I didn't experience any sort of hallucinatory effects, but I did have sensory effects where my body was so anxious that it would go to any sort of ailment, and my brain would make me believe that there was something wrong. Now, 3 years removed from losing all that weight and doing therapy and understanding what was happening, I've been able to cope with the OCD. However, the OCD is only anxiety. The compulsions are just a means to quell the anxiety. What became really important to me was to understand the difference between my identity, myself, and my thoughts. I started to think that my thoughts were me, and that my thoughts comprised who I was and what was real and what was not real. I started buying books on OCD. I started listening to podcasts on OCD, and I started to find many ways to limit the amount of compulsions that were happening. One trick I found was that I would set a certain period of time during the day that I could obsess, that I could worry, that I could be anxious about things that didn't really come true. And as I started to lessen that period during the day that I would give myself to be anxious, I was able to start to see things more clearly. Now, another thing that really helped me was meditation. Meditation, for me, it's very simple. I will focus on one of the 5 senses. So I will sit and I will cycle between all the five senses. I'll sit in a quiet place and I will just focus on smell. And then I'll do that for maybe 5-10 minutes. Then I will direct my energy to feel. What am I feeling? And I'll just focus on everything that I'm feeling. Now, these thoughts and these irrational thoughts will come up and you'll start to learn to be the observer of these thoughts. That's the idea of meditation. You want to learn to observe. You want to learn to identify with the observer, not identify with the person you're observing and the person that you are. The level of OCD I experienced is something I have never experienced before in my life as far as intensity of emotions go. I would be obsessing about things that had happened 5 years ago. I'd be worrying about things I said to a girlfriend 10 years ago. But through my practices and through my time of understanding that I actually had this illness, I've been able to learn to control it. And it doesn't show itself as much anymore. I've gotten so much better. If the worst part was a number 10, I'd say I'm at a 1 now. The only thing I kind of worry about sometimes is sanitation, cleanliness. But I've learned to be cognizant of the thoughts that are being created by my mind and the thoughts that I'm creating. Our brains are somewhat like radios. There's a lot of thoughts and a lot of frequencies and a lot of things going on and spinning at one time. What you need to do and what I need to do and continue to do is to sit and let all that dust settle in that dirty glass of water. Those thoughts, those things, everything you're worrying about are like little pieces of dirt. And as you learn to sit, let that stuff settle, you learn to be able to see things clearer as opposed to the water when it's dirty. Now that's sort of a vague metaphor, but for me, my thoughts oftentimes are negative and they are cognitive distortions that aren't real. Now, it's often considered a long-lasting or chronic disorder. Just like having diabetes, which I have, it's something you can't get rid of, you just have to learn to manage it. Disease can be crippling and uncontrollable. These thoughts, known as obsession, and the behavior that follows, known as the compulsion, is an urge like thirst, and it goes over and over and over again. Studies show that females have a higher prevalency of this and they experience it more. Now, anxiety disorders are treatable. However, only about 35% of people get treatment. Now, there's lots of types of anxiety disorders. There's GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder. There's panic disorder. There's social anxiety disorder. There's all types of phobias. There's, of course, PTSD, which we all know is something that really affects people's lives. Unfortunately, anxiety disorders often come with other disorders like depression. I'll do a whole nother episode on my experience with depression and the treatments I've received. Now, faith and God alone cannot help you when it comes to OCD. It can definitely help, and prayer is something that I would definitely put into a regimen of someone experiencing stress and anxiety. But other options are better. Talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even sometimes medication-assisted therapy. That could be holistic or Western medicine, Eastern medicine. I would go for the herbs and plants first. Now, there are millions of people that suffer from OCD in the United States, around 1.2% of the population. Now, there are people that say that you can be fully cured of this, but I don't know if I buy it because sometimes it hits me again and I'll get these weird compulsions in my mind. However, there are studies that show that 10% of people have fully cured this. It seems to be a somewhat controversial topic. However, a lot of this stuff is just so subjective. To put it in perspective, 1 in 100 people in the United States suffer from it. 1 in every 100 children suffer from it. And OCD is fairly common. I would say that, and this is obviously just my own opinion, but I would say that if you are obsessing over something, such as something you've done, a thought, something you're gonna do, lock the door, and you're spending about an hour a day on this, you might have OCD. The exact cause of OCD is somewhat unknown. However, in my opinion, I think it comes from trauma resulting in anxiety and then resulting in you trying to combat that anxiety with these compulsions. People with OCD may lack serotonin in the cerebral cortex that communicate with deeper portions of the brain. Now, I found out I was having these compulsions fairly early in my experience with it. A lot of times it can take up to 10 years for people to realize what they're doing is compulsive behavior. Now, the main thing that really helps with OCD is something called exposure therapy. Essentially, what exposure therapy is you expose yourself to the things that make you really anxious. Let's go back to the example of people who are worried about sanitation and being clean. One way that they can learn to face their fears and overcome this so that the compulsions become less is to expose themselves to what's making them very anxious. In the case of someone washing their hands, what they would do is when they felt the compulsion to wash their hands, they wouldn't. And then possibly they would make their hands a little dirty, say they'd touch a couple cups, pots, and pans, and then they would hold back on not washing their hands. Now, this can feel really hard for some people, but exposing yourself to your anxiety and not giving in to the delusion of what it is that you're worried about, hopefully you'll gain a tolerance for these obsessive thoughts. And little by little by little, they won't hold as much power. And the fact is that OCD is one of the most debilitating illnesses in the world. At the end of the day, we're all dealing with something, and it's good to try to have compassion for everyone. I'm really still learning to deal with everything myself, but I've finally come to a time where I know who I am and I know what I'm capable of. I know my restrictions, I know things I can't do, I know my triggers, and just knowing what it was that was causing me this anxiety, being the OCD, really gave me a relief and led to me being able to find, and at the end of the day, that was exposure therapy, meditation, exercise, and being gentle with myself through the process. If you're someone that's experiencing OCD, you're already having a shitty fucking time. There's no need to beat yourself up any further. Now, I'm not at a place where I'm going to be giving therapy sessions to people, but I'm certainly someone you could reach out to and talk to, and I could relate to you on all sorts of things that you're going through. My struggle with mental health goes way far beyond OCD, and I'll be doing lots more videos on my experience, strength, and hope. So if you stuck along this long, thank you. I hope you got something from this, and we'll talk to you next show.